Thank you so much for being here. We're really happy to present our show, which just opened last night. I'm Abigail Celis. I'm a professor of art history and museum studies at the University of Montreal. And this is, I'll let you introduce.
Hi, I'm Cosmo Whyte. I'm a professor at UCLA in the visual arts department. Yeah, specifically drawing and painting.
And do you want to say a little bit about your artistic practice in general?
Yeah. So I'm an interdisciplinary artist, primarily employing drawing, painting, and some installation work that looks at the intersection between migration, displacement, and post-colonial nationhood. Yeah.
And in my research, I think a lot about the questions of museums and decolonization, diaspora of objects, and the areas I research the most are kind of France and parts of Francophone Africa. So the project that we're presenting at this gallery, which is part of the University of Montreal's gallery, is in their research creation alcove. So it's a part of the gallery that's dedicated to faculty or student projects that are engaging in a research creation process, which works really well with this project and our collaboration, which started actually in 2015. So in 2015, the title of the overall project is the Catalogue of Speculative Translations, which we began in 2015 when I was doing research in France, looking at how French museums would display collections of African art and material culture. And this was a moment in time when the question of restitution and return was completely off the table in France. It was not even something being discussed. It was considered impossible because of the legal apparatus that they have there. And so I wanted to think about these objects that I was encountering and how we could invite other narratives and other ways of looking at them that would somehow escape the museum, even if they couldn't be physically moved to other spaces. And I thought about using translation as a tool for escape, because when we talk about translation, we always talk about things that are lost in translation, but also things that are created, new meanings and associations that weren't in the original that emerge. So I decided to invite Cosmo to think about this with me.
And so within my own practice, this question of translation was something that I've been thinking about as well, more specifically in terms of what happens in a diaspora context when things are taken out from one context and placed in a new context. So this very much interested me. And then so Abigail would send me these translations, and I created a series of drawings, 9 drawings at the time, that were purely based on my interpretation of these translations. And I purposefully did not try to seek any other context for what I was reading. And I was also trying to think of what was being described as existing in a contemporary setting. So all of the signifiers that I would draw on would have a contemporary visual codex to them, so that it would read in the present.
And we should specify that. So the translations I was sending him were translations of text labels that I'd found in this museums that I was studying. So the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, which is basically a museum of non-European art, the African and a museum specifically of African art. That was a private museum called the Dapper Museum, also in Paris, but that has since closed. And then the museum, the African Museum of Lyon, which was in the city of Lyon in France, also a private museum that was founded and run by the Society of African Missions. So initially a missionary collection that became a museum. So I would translate those text labels from English into French, kind of doing purposefully bad translations to kind of show the disciplinary language of the museum that's not the same as a vernacular language, and kind of creating these somewhat strange texts that were what he was creating drawings from. And so this first collaboration taught us a lot of things. It changed the way we were thinking about translation, where we became really interested in the element of repetition as well. Translation is repetition in another language. So we were interested in furthering our exploration of repetition, continuing our exploration of opacity. So like what gets kind of obscured or redacted in a translation. And we also realized with our first collaboration, which was this very one-to-one relationship between going from like visual object to museum text label to another text back to a visual object. It was very linear and very focused. We realized we were still in this museum mode of kind of ocular centrism of looking at things and not engaging other senses. So we knew we wanted to continue the project, but think of ways we could engage other senses or engage the body of the visitors differently. And so that, wanted us to work on Act 2, which we will now talk about. So we wanted to continue this exploration, but work with a new site. And I found out about this Museum of African, Amerindian, and Oceanic Art that was based in Marseille, which had a lot of the same museographic techniques that I'd been seeing at the Musée du Quai Branly and other spaces. It was very dark inside, a lot of use of vitrines that actually created a lot of reflections and made it sometimes difficult to see the objects and beings that were being displayed. But what really spoke to me about this museum was when I found out that the building it was housed in, which is a 17th century building, in the first half of the 20th century, it served as a transit center for troops going to or coming from France's colonies. So there was this strange parallel between a period in this building's life where people who were enlisted from the colonies to serve the interests of empire were passing through there, and now objects from those same regions were also being held there, again, kind of to serve the interests of empire. So we wanted to explore those parallels and think about that space, continuing to think about the conceptual questions that we had.
So we spent the equivalent of 2 months cumulatively between 2017 and 2018 and 2019 in Marseille through a residency in Cassis, Carmargo Foundation. And while in Marseille at the museum, we recorded footage, we recorded audio. The audio aspect of the project hasn't been activated yet. That will probably be in the next act. And what you're seeing here, particularly we'll focus on this one first, the slide projectors, are both stills from the video itself and also collages made from archival materials that Abigail was able to attain. And when specifically in the context of the collages were used as a way of enacting this act of opacity, of obscuring and protecting the identities of the those subjects of the archives.
Again, since we were really interested in thinking of these questions of fugitivity and captivity, like what can escape the museum space, we wanted to explore that materially by thinking about still images and moving images and blurring the boundary between still images and moving images. So that's why we started with filmed footage, but then created slides, which are fixed. It's stopping the motion, but then reintroducing motion and other narratives through a different sequence of images. And this layering that Cosmo was talking about, where more than one image is superposed on itself with different levels of transparency. And what you're seeing right now in the slide projector are stills from the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea that we filmed, superposed with an image from a shadow in the museum, which became kind of a central motif for our video and film that maybe you want to talk about.
Yeah. So another thing we were very mindful of was not filming the objects directly. So what are the ways in which they could be referenced without reference while negating this kind of the gaze or the consumption of these objects within this space of capture. So one of the things that really captivated us was a shadow cast in the entrance of the museum space by one of the objects. And there was a moment in which you'll see it in the beginning of the film, someone walks across the shadow, and the shadow became a motif that has been repeated. And within the slide projector, what we have done is map the trajectory of escape of the shadow through the museum space, through the museum space, out the doors, through the archives, to the ocean, and then beyond. Yeah.
So all of the three kind of installations are in conversation, but there's a little bit of a tighter dialogue between the slide projector and the film that you will see on this side, because it's, a lot of this very same source material. So in this, we again worked with this idea of still and moving images, where in editing the video, well, from the start, filming, we did a lot of still shots using a tripod to just hold the camera still and kind of capture the museum architecture, the inside of the museum, and then again, sort of the scape, the parts of Marseille's neighborhood, the ports, as this was once one of France's most important ports for colonial commerce. We did a lot of blurring in the initial filming, so filming things coming in and out of focus.
Shallow and deep depths of field, and slow transitions between those.
A lot of extreme close-ups, again, with this idea of wanting to allude to certain objects while respecting their privacy, not showing them fully, not being in a direct representational relationship, filming the reflections of the vitrines rather than what's inside them. And again, mixing in bits from archival material related either to the building during its time that it was a colonial barrack, or related to archival material I found from soldiers from the colonies that passed through that space. And so we had already built in all of these modes of repetition and opacity in the film itself, but we knew that when we projected it, we wanted to enhance that even more.
So since 2019, I have been working with these series of beaded curtains as a way of thinking through fugitivity and opacity, oftentimes requiring the viewer to activate it and that transition from spectator into active participant in the activation of the artwork. And in this case, the curtain is designed to fit this alcove. And once the image hits the curtain, there's a doubling that happens as the curtain is interacting, the image is interacting with the curtain and the back wall. So there's this doubling that happens. And it's also another way of allowing another layer of transparency into the work. or operating like a sheet of vellum or some kind of mediation. You're invited to part the curtain so you can see things more legibly. However, your shadow is then implicated into the scene, and that will also act as a form of redaction as well, and also implicating you or involving you in an act of redaction or opacity.
And once you let go of the curtain, the strings of beads keep swaying for a while. So again, that adds another layer of movement to images that are sometimes still and sometimes moving. And again, we were trying to think about all of these pieces together. So you'll notice the curtain is painted black, but not all of the paint stayed on. So it's a metal bead curtain painted black, but some of the paint chips off. So this creates that kind of glittery reflective surface, again, recalling the reflective space of the museum, using reflection as a mode of obstruction or of change of the original image. And that then Cosmo like recalled in some of the materials chosen for the drawings and collages that he made, if you want to talk about them.
Yeah. So I also use this project as a way of a bit of a departure from my own practice somewhat. There's still motifs that will reappear, but the manner in which I approach these drawings feel very different from how I draw outside of this project. And it's way more process oriented. So the materials used to create the beaded curtains are the materials that are also employed in making the drawings. So you'll have shadows or remnants of the beads themselves, and the actual beads were used to create these. And then we decided to not frame the work, but to have it pinned up using magnets as a way to hearken to the in process nature of this practice. And there was a sense of improvisation to this entire project. So the magnets moved from being purely functional to now having a formal quality within the drawings themselves.
Yeah, the magnets, which are these little metal beads that you see here, they recall the beads of the curtain. They're also reflective. The ones that are flipped on their sides, like in the second drawing, cast more of a shadow than the ones that are laying flat, recalling again both your shadow in the projected space, the motif of the object's shadow that we kind of track and follow. And so once again, the way the original project also feeds into this is with this relationship to text. So we went back to the museum labels that I had initially translated for Cosmo, and added some new ones from the new museum we were looking at. And he once again read through them, and based on those texts, that also brought kind of ideas of how the drawings should be made, what should be alluded to and represented, what kind of emotions, senses, and narratives should be evoked. But a few important differences in the first project, as I was mentioning, we had this very one-to-one relationship, one drawing related to one text. We wanted much more of a blurring and breaking apart. So now we placed all 9 text labels together, and there's no one text that refers to one drawing or set of collages. They all are in conversation with each other. This is also partly because we're now at a different historical moment in the French context, where this question of restitution that was foreclosed when we began the project has been broken open, and there have been restitutions that have been made. There will be more that are being made. Not everything is easy or simple, of course, as you all know, but it is now a possibility. So we were also thinking of like, what happens to these objects that have cohabited together now for some time and may be dispersed when they go back to their places of origin? and what are kind of the relationships that they have formed in diaspora that will be reconfigured if they go back, or if some of them go back, if some of them stay. So we wanted this kind of more of a constellation form of the drawings, where you're also seeing relationships between the drawings and not just between one drawing and one text. And for the texts, we decided again to continue our exploration of opacity. So I reformatted the text labels. So, all 9 of them now have the same font, the same thing. So they kind of look like they came from the same place, but I kept as much of the original formatting as possible. So things that were bolded or italicized in the original text label are there. If there were lines, if there were numbers, if there were brackets, they're all there. These are presented in the original French, not the translations. But we covered them with sheets of vellum to make them a little bit harder to read. And then I annotated the sheets of vellum. So what you see is less the original text and more our conversation with it. So the questions is elicited for us, and the questions we wanted to ask of the objects or wanted to ask of the museum, as well as kind of annotations to mark some of the codes of the museum. So you'll often see in text labels the name of the person who collected or donated the object. And in the cases of African collections, it's often European or Western names. So those are circled in red. More rarely, you'll see the name of the African creator or a historical figure that was important to that object's life from Africa. If those names appear, they're circled in gold, which is much harder to see because there's less known about them, there's less information given about them, and they're kind of easily lost in the archive. And then things like slashes to note whenever non-French words were used, which tended to be italicized. So the slash is kind of recalling those formatting decisions of how the museum marks what is foreign and not foreign, what is part of their cultural world and what is coming from a different culture. So as Cosmo has mentioned, this is very much a place of experimentation and process for us. And we wanted to render that visible as well. We wanted to, not invisibilize kind of the systems of knowledge that we're part of and that we're reproducing as we think through these questions. So we added a little kind of bibliography. So there's a drawer that's labeled author, which just has the references of different readings that we were discussing that were part of our conversation. There's a drawer labeled questions, which contains questions that were generated for and through the project, some of which are also shown in the slide projectors or some on the video. But in the drawer, the questions are placed next to citations from the readings we were doing that helped us generate or refine those questions or that might offer possible answers. And then every learning process has its errors and missteps and failures. And so we kept an error drawer, which is what would happen when I started typing up. Sorry, I didn't show them. These are typewritten on a mechanical typewriter that my great uncle had given my mother a long time ago. So as I was typing up the cards, I, of course, made mistakes. When you make a mistake on a typewriter, it's not like, Microsoft Word, you can't delete it. You have to throw it out and start over. Except we didn't throw them out. We decided to keep them to sort of document, reference the mistakes or just, the process of learning and also the labor, right? Because it took much longer to type up these cards because there's like almost as many errors as finalized cards. And we also, the idea of having them in cards and drawers is with this idea as we activate the space, get questions, have conversations with other people, there's probably new questions that will be generated. There'll be other readings that'll come to mind that we might not have realized influence our project. So I can keep adding more references, more questions, more citations along the way. And an interesting thing about this drawer that we're using, I worked with the university to source something and we didn't know what they'd find. And what they found was this index card catalog that had been created by a local arts critic and writer named Émile Falardeau, who worked on the 20th century on modern and contemporary Canadian and European artists. So he, this was pre-computer era. So he would cut out press clippings related to the artists he was studying, glue them into binders, and then created this catalog system to keep track of what was in his binders. So we decided to keep that in here just to show kind of another person's way of organizing their knowledge and, how did he know what he knew? It's like all documented here. So we thought that was an interesting response with thinking about how museums organize knowledge and how we were organizing knowledge for our projects. So I think that's about it.
We can open up to questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how long is this exhibition going to be on?
It'll be up till March 1st. Yes. 2.5 months about, yeah.
I have a question about like the participatory elements because whenever I work on exhibitions, I'm not a curator, but I always do the coordination part. So I'm always thinking through like how do you make the participation work? And I'm wondering, like, have you noticed, like, do people, sometimes it's just like an intriguing object. So like somebody might come and try to just touch this because it's shiny. Do you find, but then sometimes people, I think, also kind of police themselves in the gallery space. So I find that sometimes we try to do participatory things, but then people feel like very scared to actually participate. And I was just wondering what your experiences are with that, if there's anything that's like working or that becomes kind of a challenge for you in that regard, or yeah, anything. It's super interesting.
Are you thinking specifically in this project or just generally? Yeah.
And things like that, and even the test here,
Yeah.
the stuff that you could open it, but will people open it? So
Yeah, I think well, we have to make it known that you can touch. I mean, touch is such as you say, people will police themselves. We've been told, and it's been reinforced over and over in museums, don't touch anything. And we're trying to find subtle ways of subverting that. So I mean, this opened yesterday, so there's still time. We still have to collect data, but we've been encouraging people to touch, and once that permission has been given, we've noticed people interacting with it.
In the label, it says like, please interact with the curtain, but we've definitely noticed like if we orally say it, encourage it, and once one person is playing with it, then a lot of people start playing with it. The gallery assistants have also been told to tell people orally, you can play with the curtain, you can open the drawers, which we hope will help when we're not here. I'd say in your previous work, you've also kind of forced touch in some ways. I don't know if you want to talk about it.
So in my previous works, what I would typically do is have the curtain at a point in the exhibition, working with the architecture that forces you to walk through it in order to get to the rest of the show. So, and that will be your initial interaction with the work. So, yeah, forcing that kind of contact. And I've noticed there's a negotiation that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, at one point I thought maybe I should put my typewriter here and leave note cards and leave some of the books we read and let people add note cards, but I ended up deciding I don't think people will use it. I think it's a little bit too big of a leap. It's also not that comfortable to stand and type. So I felt like I didn't have the space to encourage a long enough interaction. So we decided, okay, let's, again, this is a place of experimentation. So let's see if people even open the drawers and flip through them. And if so, maybe if we do this again, we can think of how to how to build that in more profoundly, I guess. Yeah. Yes.
So I just have a question from someone joining on Zoom. So this question comes from Alice. So how did or might in the future the research creation rub in the sense of like creating friction, tension, or repel against or towards objects and other belongings in other non-European collections? So just creating like this question of like tension and friction. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm thinking it's so there's different ways to answer this. One is thinking about the points of friction, tension, and the spark that that might create in the research process. So think research creation process, so certain roadblocks that we hit, for example. Also just the question of time and the fact that, you know, we were kind of preparing this in 2018, 2019, started working on the video, conceiving works. And then the pandemic happens and everything stops. And then we both move institutions. And so there was this kind of forced time away from the material before coming back to it. But it also meant we came in with kind of a different set of, or we were at a different stage of thinking about some of the same questions. So what we produced is certainly not what we would have produced 4 years ago, but it created other things. And then I don't know if part of the question is, you know, this is working with African collections, other non-European, like Indigenous Canadian and such. For now, we've stayed working with African museums and African collections, partly because that's more my area of research expertise, and Cosmo's both personal and research. Yeah. But I think there could be really interesting conversations that would both show resonances and incommensurabilities. And I think some of them are about distance. So, you know, these collections are in a territory that's not indigenous territory. It's not, they're very much not in their homeland. Whereas what you have in settler colonial contexts like Canada or the US, you're on the same, we're all on right now indigenous territory. Oh, I think something happened to the, do you want to turn that off and we'll fix that? Friction and tension happening right now. Yeah, so I think there's definitely, we'd have to think about the relationships and the relationship with opacity and visibility in different ways.
There was just a brief follow-up from Alice's earlier question. So she was asking more specifically about like what interactions between the, I guess like African objects in a specific collection with other non-European objects. So things like oceanic objects or Southwest Asian, what kind of like frictions or like interactions were there, if any?
In the Marseille space, the sections were very separate. So there'd be like one gallery that was the African section, one gallery that was the Oceanic section, one that was the what they call the Amerindian section. But I think connections could be built, and a project like this could build those connections. It's not something that we did, but it would be a different way to break up the museum space and kind of not accept their classifications. But, you know, we were thinking a lot about objects in movement. So thinking about, okay, what are objects from these other cultural spaces? What is the movements that they are alluding to that they were part of? Tracing patterns of cross migration could have also been possible, definitely with the history of colonial troops in the way there's really interesting research being done right now about Senegalese troops that were part of the French army in Vietnam or other territories of the French colonies, and kind of the again these tensions and frictions because they were, you know, part of the military force that was repressing the rebellion and the fight for independence. But there are also relationships that were built, men who got married with women from Vietnam, and then those women moved to Senegal. So there's definitely a much broader thing that could happen with a lot of interesting stories. I don't know if
Yeah, I would also say that the nature of the building, the architecture of the building, it prohibited that kind of dialogue. Not all, yeah, the galleries didn't bleed into one another. You had literally had to exit one gallery, walk, in the pathway, the balcony outside to get to the next. Yeah, so
which I think speaks to kind of France's politics of those spaces as well, of trying to keep these colonial territories not in solidarity, but all like referencing the metropole, the center points. Yeah. So something that should be explored, but I can't say that we did in our project. Yeah.
Well, I will say we were thinking a lot about the architecture and the architecture of containment. And in fact, at one point, this video piece was going to be called The Architecture of Containment. We were looking at it and thinking about this what Abigail just eloquently said of how the architecture harkens back to France's more colonial ethos. But yeah.
No questions. Okay. Thank you so much for questions on Zoom in person. It's feel free to look around the space. We'll hang out so we can continue the conversation more informally. Thanks.